thank you for your overwhelming participation and joining us today in the session. I now hand it over to our chairperson, Sunil Mitra, former Revenue and Finance Secretary, Government of India, and the chairperson of the Economic Affairs Committee, to take the proceedings of this meeting forward.
Thank you, Sombik. I would firstly, on behalf of Bengal Chamber and its Economic Affairs Committee, I would like to welcome all the participants in today's workshop, in today's webinar. I would also like to welcome all the members we have had more than 500 registrations. I don't know how many we have been able to accommodate in this session, but the response has been very, very good indeed, beyond our expectations. And I would like to also thank our young colleagues in the Chamber Secretariat who have worked very hard to kind of get this together, and who would be listening very attentively, and who would turn out a report at the end of this session. Well, not at the end of this session, but shortly thereafter. I would also like to specially welcome Professor Ajitava Rai Chaudhary for agreeing to moderate this session. And the subject, as you know, is extremely topical. The Finance Minister is unveiling, hopefully, an attractive package for industry and for kickstarting the economy, agriculture as well. And we will get to the details of that later on. Having said this, and without further ado, over to, I especially welcome Kaushik, and we are lucky that Professor Basu is with us in the country. And I'm very glad, and thank you very much for joining in and sharing your time with us. Over to you, Professor Rai Chaudhary. Please take forward the session.
আমি তো এবার এগুলো ঠিক করলাম ভিডিওটা বাদ দিয়ে
প্রফেসর রায় চৌধুরী
তুমি ডেস্কটপ থেকে কিভাবে নিলে
ডেস্কটপ থেকে করিনি
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay.
I hope I have been.
Yes,
you were audible, and you know, we have a very I guess it will be a very stimulating session ahead. In fact, what we want to know is, given this COVID-19 and unprecedented situation, it started health-wise, but then the economy really stopped, and it's a global pandemic, and we are searching for the way out. Obviously, we're interested about our own economy. That's the Indian economy is really our point of focus. But we know that in this age of global relationship and globalization, it's a global problem. And as everybody is saying, it has to be a concerted action worldwide in order for the world economy to revive. And Indian economy, you know, along with that, will carry on.
Normal white color.
Hello? Yes. Well, today we have, as Mr. Mitra just said, we have a very distinguished panel, and we have as our guest speaker, Professor Kaushik Basu, and we are lucky that he can spare some time for this Bengal Chamber of Commerce webinar, and we are all looking forward to that for Kaushik Basu's speech as a guest speaker. And we have Abhirup Sarkar from ISI, Professor Bhanumurthy from NIPFP, Mr. Debashish Mollik, ex-IDBI DGM, and then Mr. Mukherjee from Axis Bank. So Mukhopadhyay, I think you just call yourself, right? So we have a very distinguished panel, and without wasting much time, let me just ask Kaushik Da, I call him Kaushik Da actually, Professor Basu. I will just flag certain couple of you know, points which I have gathered from the number of articles he has written recently in connection with this COVID-19 and its economic impact. And I just have two things on which I wish, apart from other things, he can speak on other things too. The inequality issue and the kind of taxation which the economy should have. It's one of the things which he's talking consistently in recent days. And the other is the apprehension that we might return to a license permit Raj and a bureaucratic control as an antidote to the market economy, which has not functioned that well in this global pandemic. So he has written on that too. So these two things I certainly will request Professor Basu to touch upon. Apart from that, Professor Basu is an eloquent speaker, is a very world-class researcher. So we are all eager to hear from him. Professor Basu, if you can just take over, and about how much time do you require? 25 minutes or 20?
Yeah, that's what we planned, roughly 25 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Basu. If you can just take over now and just
Sure.
Let's hear from you.
Ojitabo, thank you very much. Sunil, thank you very much. Sunil and I were colleagues in the Ministry of Finance. It is actually somewhat ironic that it needed a pandemic for this event to happen, because Sunil Mitra and I have been talking for quite some time to have an event with the chamber. But I come to India a lot, but it's usually Delhi, few days in Calcutta. It was just not happening. But now here I am, sitting in India, lockdown in Mumbai. And for that, you've got a very interesting group of speakers here, because the person responsible for my being in India in the lockdown is Bhanu Murthy, because it was being planned. I had come to deliver the Raja Chelaya lecture in Delhi, quite a grand event, and I was really looking forward to the big Raja Chelaya lecture. And I had decided that I'd spend a few days with my daughter in Mumbai, who lives in Mumbai, and then go to Delhi, give the lecture and go back. When the lecture was cancelled and the lockdown happened, so here I am still sitting in Mumbai, but luckily with a family. It's very nice. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is a very, very difficult situation. In fact, one feels grateful that one is not in the actual position taking decisions and pushing in policies, because there's just so much uncertainty. I, for myself, had really, after my 7 years in the world of policymaking in India and the World Bank, I had happily gone back into academic research, and that is what I was doing. When sitting in India, the pandemic breaks, and I just felt that it will be utterly irresponsible. This is not my field, but I still have to get back to whatever expertise I have to get into this. And Ojitabo referred rightly, over the last couple of weeks, I've written a huge amount on the economic fallout of the pandemic. See, in the beginning, the reason why I felt I ought to get involved, and India in particular, this is my country, I've lived here, and I was concerned about, is the initial debate all over the world, and including India, was should we pay more attention to controlling the COVID or the economy? It was COVID versus the economy. And if ever you say you have to pay some attention to the economy, the initial reaction was that, are you crazy? It should be lives first. And my instinct was, yes, it was lives first. But to think of the economy as nothing to do with lives is a huge mistake. And I was worried that in our attention to control the COVID, we would allow the economy to languish, and this could come back and hit us very, very badly. Another debate I was getting pulled into, all this happened in the last sort of 4 weeks, was the World Bank in Africa. And I was very glad, this was some 4 weeks ago, in the discussions I found that in the World Bank, people are now suddenly paying a lot of attention to the economic side of what's happening in Africa, because it's a poor region. And the debate was changing from lives versus economy to what I was calling it as lives versus lives. There are certain parts of the economy which are relatively more abstract, and indeed I feel we should ignore those for now. But there are also aspects of the economy. Food chain, food getting to people, basic jobs, migrants. We've seen the suffering of the workers. Those are immediate economic problems. and you have to pay attention to this. Luckily, I believe that the first moves that India made were broadly the right moves. There were lots of organizational problems, and you can see the huge suffering, the painful suffering of the poor and the migrants, but broadly that you need a quick lockdown, you need people to get disciplined about this, all that was called for. What is important now is here onwards, and over the last 1 week, I have written a couple of pieces saying that really a lot will depend on how we exit from this lockdown over the next month, month and a half. And today we will get details coming out from the Ministry of Finance about exactly what we are planning to do. And that's going to be crucial. I feel the landscape of the global economy will change in important ways. There will be winners that will come out of this, and there will also be losers that will come out of this. The fact that India was doing well does not mean India will continue to do well. India's growth had slowed down even before the pandemic, but there were other indicators. The long run indicators were very good, and I was optimistic, but things can go wrong, so you have to be careful. Part of the problem is to do with ordinary people and our psychology. And I want to start with something which may sound a bit abstract, but I think it's very important, so I still must make the point. People perceive danger and risk. In times of crisis, they perceive danger and risk wrongly very often. They misread risk and the probability of danger wrongly. And that can jeopardize how you behave, whether you go out to work, whether you interact, a whole lot of things. And this is something I have to say very carefully, because not for a moment do I want to decry that this is a very, very risky situation. Because there are global leaders who have been disastrous absolutely by completely dismissing it. Bolsonaro, I mean, Brazil is a standout among emerging economies with COVID deaths and the incidence of COVID. And I feel Bolsonaro gets a lot of that responsibility for downplaying it. So the thing is not to downplay, but that we do read risks wrong is important. And in this age of social media, that can happen very easily. And I'll point to two things. How you get information can have big impressions in the human brain, irrespective of statistics. So the hard statistical data can get pushed to the background. If you are on social media, on Twitter, on getting information continuously from chat groups, your probability calculations can go completely wrong. And in psychology, there is a big literature called on salience. How saliently you get an information can create different impressions in your head. And the one example I'll give you is someone planning to buy a car, does a lot of research and discovers that 10,000 cars were studied and the safest brand is a brand called brand X. I don't want to take the name of a car, don't want to advertise or criticize. Brand X is the car this person wants to buy. A massive statistical study shows that it's the safest brand. There are studies that show that if that evening, just before next day's purchase, this person meets a friend and says, I've decided to buy brand X. And the friend says, are you crazy buying brand X? My uncle bought a brand X car 7 days ago, and there was a disastrous accident the next day. With a whole lot of people, this information will cause a change in decision. The 10,000 car statistical study will get pushed into the background, and this looms large. And this is happening just all the time. You can talk to people and see that probabilities are getting messed up. There's another one for which I'm going to, the only PowerPoint I will show you is one page. COVID statistics are being massively misread. And for the reason as follows, that, and a part of this responsibility is with Western well-off countries, Europe and United States. Responsibility, I don't want to blame anyone. No one was doing it deliberately, but these relatively small European countries give out data all in terms of absolute numbers. These are the number of people who have been infected. This is the number of people who have died. And when you look at these numbers, these absolute numbers, India turns out to be pretty high up on the list. I mean, you'll hear on television all the time that India is the 12th most badly affected country. But this is population uncorrected. And that's actually in many ways a meaningless thing to do. I'll give you some numbers straight away. The number of deaths in India, COVID deaths, is estimated to be 2,500, just short of 2,500. Switzerland is about 1,900. So 1,900 dead in Switzerland. India is 2,500. So people will say, look, more people are dying in India than in Switzerland. But pause for one moment. Switzerland's population is 8 million. India's population is 1.3 billion. Make that correction, and then it does not look as bad. And I'm going to now pull out some numbers. Let me explain what the numbers are. Let me try to do the sharing straight away, and I'll tell you. Are you people able to see this?
We can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm giving you, this is the only technical bit that will come in here. This is called the crude mortality rate, which is the number of people who are dying due to COVID-19 as corrected by population size. So the way I present this data is for 1 million people population, not infected people. 1 million of your population, what's the number that is dying? The red column on the left is European economies, and concentrate on that for the moment. Don't look at the right hand. I shouldn't have allowed you to see the right hand side, but it's too late now. So concentrate on the left. In Belgium, of 1 million people, up to now, 756 have died. Spain, Italy, go through the list. Germany is one of the best performing European countries, and 93 is in Germany. So this is Germany. 93 per million. Crossover to India. Here's India on the right-hand side in blue, where you have 756, 576 for Spain, 93 for Germany. India is 2. Even if you say India is undercounting deaths, COVID deaths, the reason I'm looking at COVID deaths rather than COVID infection is COVID infection, the number of people is very difficult to be sure. COVID deaths is much better. We count deaths better. Still, there can be mistakes. Let us suppose that we are undercounting 10 times. Instead of 2, India is 20. It's still way less than Germany and way less than Belgium for sure, Spain for sure, Italy for sure, UK, France, USA. But it's not just India. So, and that you have to pause when you see differences of this kind. The right-hand side is emerging economies. Argentina, Indonesia, China, Pakistan, South Africa, I've got these countries in the list, and Ethiopia is extremely low, 0.04. Do note, Ethiopia is very low. In Africa, South Africa is one of the highest, which is 3. Still nothing compared to Europe. What's happening? You can't dismiss this altogether. One of the problems also was when you see these kinds of differences that across the belt, basically equator and north of the equator, you get these very low numbers and much higher in Europe. People begin to ask questions. Are we all standing on the foothills of a similar rise as happened in Europe? And at one level, I'm glad that WHO was warning us, reminding us that, look, remember, this could be the start of a similar peak. That was the worst case scenario. Here is my thing. You have to keep that in mind. You have to follow tough policies, and I'm glad that we followed tough policies in the beginning. But we cannot allow that to become the norm and think of the worst case scenario as the scenario that is unfolding. And when you see such a broad difference between one set of countries, all in relative warm climates above the equator around the world, all in relatively emerging economies, developing countries where you've had tuberculosis, BCG, malaria, there is the plausibility that the differences are caused by that. And therefore, you have to begin to pay attention to the economic side of it along with the side. I am beginning to feel hopeful now about India because the economic side is beginning to come into the play and picture much more. I want to remove the the sharing, let that go aside. I don't need to share the data anymore. Let me come back to just the description of now a couple of things on the trade-off. See, there I can see some hands for questions Is it okay if I don't take the questions right now, but take them later?
No, it will be done later.
Yeah.
It will be done later.
Let me
Just
just
continue.
carry on. I will take just another 10, 15 minutes more, and then I'll stop. So you have to go for the unlocking of the lockdown, and you have to go quickly. And what we have now understood, which in the beginning was again unclear, is we use one word, lockdown, for many different things. There is a study now coming out of Oxford, which breaks up the lockdown into 8 different categories. Do you lock down schools or don't you lock down schools? Do you lock down large gatherings? Don't you lock down large gatherings? Do people have to be confined to homes? Do you allow them to go out into open spaces? A variety of these dimensions. We are at a stage now where you can't stop the lockdown altogether, but you have to begin to differentiate between these. And I want to give you examples that you will probably see some rise in COVID infections as soon as you begin to unwind. But you have to worry that if you don't do that, businesses remain halted, big business and small business, and I'll come to that. Food chains remain disrupted, workers remain stranded. You will begin to get famine and food shortages, which is not so easy to count in the beginning, the suffering from that, because we know this from history. Pain from food shortage comes in slowly. People are withering away. Finally, they seldom die of not being able to eat. Before that, they'll die of other reasons. So by the time you realize it's the food shortage that is causing deaths, it becomes too late. And last night, actually, I was in a long discussion on Africa, getting data and discussion. There are the food shortages worries that are beginning to erupt. I want to take one example from outside of India, Africa, since I've been a bit involved in that. There are 2 remarkable leaders in Africa who have followed not very different policies, but different policies. Cyril Ramaphosa, quite a remarkable person, South Africa. Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister of Ethiopia. They followed different policies in the sense that the South African policy was very sharp close down. And the close down was quite total. And that period was used by Cyril Ramaphosa to build up a huge amount of health facilities. Hospitals were being shored up, medical supplies were being improved. And the whole idea was that if a calamity breaks out, we will be now ready. We will use the 3 weeks, 5 weeks to build this up. Ethiopia did not go that strong. Ethiopia, the first cases, I think, were reported on 13th March. The Prime Minister acted quickly enough. 3 days later, there were announcements, but it was not an across-the-board lockdown. In Ethiopia, it was immediately announced that schools will be closed, that large gatherings will be stopped immediately. But we will allow a lot of the markets to function and things like that. And transportation, minimum amount, controlled amount will remain open. Ethiopians came under a lot of criticism for that, but I feel Ethiopia did the right calculation. They are not as well off as South Africa to be able to use this period to immediately build up hospitals and medical supplies. For them, the informal sector is important. If that comes to a total halt, they would not be able to manage. And now we are seeing that actually in Ethiopia, the COVID deaths and all have not become as disastrous as people were fearing. India, I'm beginning to feel optimistic because there are signals coming out that India is being sensitive to these problems. And we are going to see a new phase of a very different kind of lockdown, where I'm hoping that we will allow the economy to function and allow the economy to prosper. One more comment on the economy, and then I want to give out a couple of steps that I think we should take here onwards, and then I'll stop. The strain in India of the poor is visible. I mean, at times television is difficult to watch when you're seeing people suffering. So that's clear, and there's statistical information coming in. There is a very nice study done by Sudha Narayanan and Sri Shaha, which is looking at food prices. Very difficult to collect information now in the midst of all this, but the data that they are collecting is showing that food prices are actually in pockets beginning to rise, and even over a 1 month period, there are some retail prices have risen in some villages and towns by up to 20%. And you know this, for the relatively well-off people, the 20% rise in some goods, you won't notice. But for the people on the borderline, this is just very, very painful. There are detailed studies coming out of the United States. This is by, there's a NBER paper by Laura Montenovo and co-authors. In India and in emerging economies, we don't have this kind of detailed data, but the American data is showing that as unemployment is spiking, unemployment is becoming huge in the United States and India, a disproportionate number is hitting the poorest section. The relatively illiterate people are losing employment first. Women are losing employment first. Hispanics are losing employment first. And we would like to believe that probably something similar is happening. The worst of sections are suffering more than others. So the economic side is paramount and you have to pay attention. Where do you go and what do you do? I will just list a couple of points and stop. I've said this before, that you have to have a detailed package. We will probably, starting now, we will hear the Ministry of Finance coming out with the plans. I'm waiting to hear what those are. India does have a remarkable bureaucracy. When you say this, because we have been over-controlled economy, but this was my surprise learning when I came from outside into the Indian government. It's a remarkably talented group, and there are a few people who are awful, who are corrupt, who are self-centered. But there's a whole bunch of people who are well-meaning, extremely talented. You have to harness this, and you can actually design a package to pull the economy out very, very quickly if this is packaged well. Where should the attention be? I'm no longer in government, don't have detailed information, but a couple of broad ideas that we should follow. First of all, yes, we need money. I'm glad that a big chunk was announced yesterday, money that will be used to stimulate the economy and reach out to people. That was announced yesterday. We are looking forward to. We don't know the details yet, so I can't comment on that, but we needed that. The fiscal deficit is a worry, but I have taken the line, and a whole lot of economists have taken the line. Put that worry aside. That part of the economy, I will not worry about just now. If the fiscal deficit increases, it increases over the next 6 months, 9 months. We will have to correct that after that, but allow the fiscal deficit to increase. India has a law, the FRBM Act, which sets limits on the fiscal deficit. But that's a very sophisticated law, India's FRBM law, because it recognizes that one reason why we don't want any government to overspend is overspending today means the future generations pay that price. So you don't want that to happen. So you want to control that. Yes, you want to keep that within limits, that amount. But during a natural calamity, the government can declare that and you can exceed these limits. And I feel today, state government should be allowed to spend more, the center should be allowed to spend more, and even a little bit of monetization of the fiscal spending, which means basically the Reserve Bank of India prints money to allow greater spending. You have to be cautious about that. Don't go overboard, but some amount of that is worthwhile. So that's number one. Where do you spend the money? This is what you have to do. Two. One is direct support for the poorest people. And no two ways about this. We'll worry about what is happening to the better off sections. You reach out to the poorest. The workers, the migrants, huge suffering. And this has to happen now, straight away you reach out. But you have to keep this in mind. Just giving cash benefits is not good enough. And in normal circumstances, I've been on the side of the debate that by and large, you should give benefits and don't go into too much of finer management of giving food, giving special items to people. But in a situation like this, you have to give food and healthcare directly to people for the following reason. We know from famines in history that when there is a small food shortage that takes place, it has to be a small shortage, not a big shortage. The rich will use all their buying power to buy up food. So if you give poor people some handouts with cash, as soon as they take that cash to buy food, food price will rise. It need not be a hyperinflation. It will rise to the point where the poor can't buy and the rich can buy. Every time you give a handout, price will rise a little bit. This is what happened in the Bengal famine, where 2 to 3 million people perished, and food supply was actually just about normal. There was supply chain breakdowns that happened, but they were not being able to buy. So what you need to do is you need to provide direct support of food and healthcare, and India is capable of doing that. This has to be a decentralized effort. You can't do it all centrally. Number two, people are debating, I've been asked the question, should we worry about the small firms or the big corporations? Here, I have to come in on something that Ojitabo was pushing me to go into earlier. I am worried about India's inequality. I feel it's an unacceptable level of inequality. And I have taken the view that we have to use a system of taxation where the rich pay a tax, a higher tax, wealth tax, which gets transferred to the poor. The poor cannot afford to be born into poverty is a human injustice. You can become richer in life, you can become poorer in life, but to be born into poverty, which happens in India across the board, is wrong, and we have to transfer some money. But at this point of time, at this juncture, the debate is not between big firms and small firms. What people misunderstand is it's a highly interlinked economy that we live in. If you just pay attention to the small firms and ignore the big ones and say, well, if they crash, they crash. In no time, the small firms are going to crash, because a lot of the work that small firms, the informal sector, even the self-employed person does is connected to the big corporations. So at this point of time, government has to direct immediate support to the poor, but you have to make sure that the big firms function as well. And for that, my last point, which is again a bit of an academic point I'm returning to. Again, a debate in which I'm usually on the other side, but right now I have to remind you of the invisible hand. You know, all of you, economists and others, we all know of the invisible hand. This was an idea that was first published in 1776 by Adam Smith. And Adam Smith's idea was very simple. That when you look at the world, the bewilderingly complex world, how does it function? Food arrives on your table, you go to the tailor's shop and the tailor is ready to work for you. Broadly, yes, conflicts break out, but there is also cooperation, people helping one another, providing. And Adam Smith pointed out, this is not any central dictator or a strong government that is doing it. It is the market's natural mechanism. Our own interests we look after, but the market functions through the invisible hand. The invisible hand has evolved over hundreds and thousands of years. We must never think that we can control it, stop the market from functioning, halt the economy altogether, and have bureaucrats, and I was praising them a moment ago, but have bureaucrats and the police run the state. This has not worked anywhere in the world, and it's a recipe for disaster. So, for the big corporations and the small firms, what we have to soon do, quite apart from the financial support and subsidies, I know that Minister Gadkari has announced an insurance policy for MSME, which is actually a good policy because it is not immediate use of money, but an insurance money which is being held, which can be used. So all those things are fine, but you have to give them that space to function so that they begin to produce, they begin to make profits, small firms, big firms. And right now, you don't try to make the big corrections on inequality. We will have to worry about that. And I will end with one word on inequality, but you have to allow the invisible hand to function. There's just far too many instances around the world of countries, of nations, that economies where the government thought we'll take full control and run it, but the invisible hand cannot be replaced. It'll be a story of disaster if you have a top-down control trying to run the economy. So, as I said about the one word about inequality that I wanted to mention, actually, let me put the inequality aside. If there are questions, I will come back to that. But just the license permit, Raj, I want to talk about and stop 2 minutes more on that. I want to leave time to listen to others and also to get back comments. The license permit, Raj, in India was a slow evolution. I don't think a lot of policy mistakes are no one's fault. You start out by seeing what's happening elsewhere in the world. In 1991, the big reform was made when the licensing system was scrapped. It was in the middle of that crisis. The 1991 reforms, the biggest Indian reforms, which transformed the landscape of the economy, we had the permit Raj being removed. Right now, there is a risk, but the words I'm hearing from corporates, from a variety of people, I feel the awareness has come in from policymakers that we will not make that mistake, but I must underline this once again. We can't afford to slip back into that. So we must not become a system where you have to take permission for everything. And during, of course, a crisis like this, we will have to rules of behavior and all, but we have to very quickly unwind, creating space so that people can take their own decisions and begin to function. And we don't want to slide back into that. India, on one particular indicator, the India's economy, as I mentioned, over the last 2 years, growth was slumping. No two ways, that was very worrying. But there are certain segments where we were doing well, like ease of doing business indicator. India has improved a lot, quite a sharp improvement. And that creates space for businesses to function. We want to do that. We will have to work in terms of taxation, in terms of policies for transfers to the poor. And I want to, though I'm saying that right now, we cannot be obsessed with those big long-term changes. We have to worry about that very, very quickly, because the level of inequality we have in India is unacceptable, and we have to work on that. But right now, our window is about a couple of months, and we can't afford to make mistakes to cause a big setback. We have to remember that the global players are worried about India, because in the month of March, we saw $16 billion of capital exiting India, which is the biggest outflow in a single month. There are economies around the world which are ready to grow and develop. We know that lots of global businesses are now planning to move into other countries. Vietnam is doing very well in the midst of this. South Korea is doing well. Taiwan is doing well. There are countries doing well. India has to be careful. We have to put in reforms in the midst of this so that we have a good future along with managing the current crisis. So let me stop with that, and depending on comments and questions, I could come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Excellent speech. In fact, you touched upon so many things in such a short time, starting from this data, the misinterpretation of data in absolute terms, to psychology, the salience of social media, to lockdown categories, to the African differences between South Africa and Ethiopia, all so important. Money to poor in what way, and then to what I asked you in the beginning, license permit fraud and the inequality. You touched upon everything, and so eloquently, as always. It's nothing new for me, but everybody, I think, is so much enlightened by this. Well, let me go over to the second speaker. I start the panel. In fact, I will take the questions at the end so that there is a free flow of the speech and presentations, and then we'll come back to the questions. I will go to Professor Abhirup Sarkar, Professor of Indian Statistical Institute, another very erudite scholar, and in fact, he has written on many aspects of the economy, especially developing economy. I will give him a free hand, but I will ask him to, if he can, touch upon two things. One is this whole approach, this textbook approach of the aggregate demand falling short and the aggregate supply is unstable. Can he put this framework in simple language in the present context? The policies taken in the simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, which we have heard, how much relevant is this? And the second one, since he is involved in the institutional structure of the Bengal economy, if he can touch upon this federal structure, the West Bengal's approach may be very particular to Bengal for that matter. If he can highlight and touch upon this, that will be another, important thing which we can hear from him. Over to Professor Sarkar, please.
Thank you, Ajitabu. How much time do I have? About 10 minutes?
10 to 12 minutes? Yes, sure.
10 to 12 minutes.
With no intervention, so you speak continuously.
Okay. It's really hard to talk after a speaker like Professor Kaushik Basu. Not only because one agrees basically with what he says, but also because he made a very strong point of why we should gradually relax economic lockdown. That was a very convincing argument, and I agree with him almost 100%. So what I'll try to speak about, what Ajitabu has told me to speak on, is basically the aggregate demand aggregate supply framework, it might sound a little bit theoretical, but I don't think it's totally out of place, because when one is thinking of choosing the right kind of policy, one has to understand whether the intervention should be on the demand side or on the supply side. So it's important to understand whether it's a demand problem or a supply problem. Well, I think at various levels of this COVID crisis, the shift on demand and supply should change. So let us start with a situation when the lockdown is very much on. People are unable to go to work. No production is there. People are out of job, out of income, and so on. Now, in the Indian context, so far, of course, there were regional scarcities here and there, but overall, there was not a big supply side scarcity, I would say. Agricultural production was more or less, adequate, and even industrial production, industrial goods were available on the market. Now, it could be because of a curious reason, very strange reason. We were having a recession just before the lockdown, before the crisis. So some stocks were getting piled up. Stocks were there. Now, because there is no production, those stocks, people were able to sell those stocks, consume those stocks. So whatever be the reason, supply was not the immediate problem. During the lockdown, at least the first, second phases, even the third, the problem was one of having enough income to buy the goods. In some places, there was a real scarcity, but the scarcity was one of purchasing power, not of goods. Goods were available in the market. They were available in the shops, but people did not have enough money to buy them. Now, this is a situation where demand side intervention is important. This is a situation where the government should step in and transfer direct money, or as Professor Basu said, in some cases it is better to transfer food, medicines, and so on. But in any case, this should be a demand side intervention, directly intervening with the consumers. But then, when we are thinking of lifting the lockdown, at least gradually relaxing the restrictions, we should think of the supply side. Stocks cannot last forever. This is a fact. And government is no substitute for the market economy. So the market economy has to start functioning. This is a very simple truth, and we have to realize this. So production has to start, and for that, the package, the subsidies, the supports should go to the supply side. Now, what kind of support? Roughly, I can think of two types of support. One is, especially with respect to the smaller enterprises, liquidity would be a very serious problem. Because there is not regular inflow of income, these firms would be in short of liquidity. Most of them have to pay their debts to banks or to other financial institutions, and they will be in big trouble. They're already in big trouble to pay back their loans. Here, the government has to provide easier loans at subsidized rates. If necessary, in some cases, government might even consider waiving loans, because just giving a higher moratorium for 3 more months does not really help, because it builds up the interest burden. That's all. So, if necessary, I think the government should waive some loans, and the financial sector is also affected by this. You see, if there is a series of defaults, the banks would be in serious trouble. So in this phase, I think the government should concentrate on providing liquidity and easier loans to enterprises. I will add another kind of subsidy and support, which I think is less talked about. It is a subsidy on public transport. You see, the main problem of starting production is, well, partly it's with capital, all right, but even if the government provides loans on easier terms, it is the people that have to do the work ultimately, and people cannot come to their workplaces. This is a big problem, and for that, easier transports, safer transports are to be provided. For that, transport companies, people who run buses and so on, they need to be subsidized. So that is another major subsidy that the government can think of. Yesterday, the Honorable Prime Minister talked about a huge package, which is very, very welcome. But then there are two questions. One is, where will this money come from? Of course, this money can come from various sources: taxes, debts, monetization, and perhaps a little bit of diverting funds from other kinds of expenditure. Maybe the government had other plans, but now, because of an emergency, the government might think of diverting funds. But these different modes of raising funds for this purpose will have different implications. Inflation, well, right now we may not worry too much about the rate of inflation, but if there is too much printing of money, we might have to worry about it a little bit, and then we have to resort to some kind of public borrowing by the government. For that, the government might have to raise the rate of interest a little bit. Now, I don't think that will be really harmful for the economy, because just higher interest rates, there is no evidence that higher interest rates really affect the level of investment, for example. The relationship between interest rate and investment is not very clear. And in any case, in these years of uncertainty, very little private investment would be forthcoming. So government can think of raising the rate of interest a little bit. The focus, as Prime Minister Modi said yesterday, would be on MSME. Here, West Bengal would come in, because West Bengal is, way up in terms of MSME. According to some, reports, it's number one. And if support is provided to the MSMEs, I think West Bengal should at least get a good share of this support, because West Bengal has a large number of MSMEs. But here I have one apprehension. That is, Prime Minister Modi talked about Atmanirbharata or self-reliance. And Ajitaho rightly raised this apprehension of going back to the license Raj, which Kaushik also answered. Now, in this context, I will raise the following question. Is self-reliance thought of as a short-run survival strategy? Because global supply chains are breaking down, we are thinking of self-reliance. If so, then we are thinking of self-reliance as a short-run survival strategy. Or is it a long-run shift in policy stance? That is important. Now, if it is a long-run shift, then we have to be very, very careful. we have to be careful because, well, it is a good thing to apprehend or to think of, snatching business away from the Chinese, because many people might not be willing to go to China and so on. But one has to be careful there. First of all, there are other competitors like Vietnam and so on. But also, we do not know how the Chinese are going to react to the new situation. If the Chinese are going to reduce their prices, if the Chinese are going to sweeten the deals to a large extent, then whether people will still hold on to their decision of not going to China, it's not very clear. So, but more important, if we want to go for self-reliance, probably what the Honorable Prime Minister meant was to make things in India which are sellable in the international market. He wanted us to be a part of the global supply chain. So we have to do it efficiently, not only MSME, but efficient MSME. Now, this is something that we need to build up. All MSMEs, let me be very, candid. All MSMEs are not efficient. Many of them survive just because, they are just surviving. And that is not what we should be after in the long run. So if the Prime Minister is talking about a policy shift, other reforms need to be there. And especially, I will emphasize that with so little expenditure on education and training, we cannot hope to do very well in the world market. When the Chinese are adopting the MSME, policy, gearing their MSME to serve the world market, we have to remember that the Chinese labor force is much more efficient, much more educated, much more, they are better than us, efficient. So we have to reach that efficiency, and then we can think of a long-run shift in policy. So I will just stop there. The punchline, I would say, is that the government support is required. Definitely, it's required and it's welcome, but it cannot be a substitute for the market economy. We have to revive the market economy as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Virup. It's again a very thought-provoking. Virup always does that. Whenever you hear Virup, he raises issues and questions which you have to think about. Well, let me move over to Professor Bhanumurthy. Again, I will give him freedom to what he wants to speak. I want to specifically have a couple of points for him. In fact, he speaks about that a number of places. One is the macroeconomic scenario. We hear about deficit financing, inflation, the flight of capital in the sense of FDI has slowed down, etc. What's the macroeconomic scenario what's likely to be in the context of economic stimulus and other packages? The second issue is just the package which we heard about, just the general nature of that 20 crore package. Apparently, the 4.8% of the GDP was already committed. So another 5.2% or so will come through now in the additional. And he combined the two together came in the fiscal and monetary policy came together. So is that a wise way to declare a stimulus where the fiscal and monetary policy, they have different multiplier, different kind of implications in the economy? So these 2 points, if you just touch upon, along with your other comments. Professor Bhanumurthy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor Ajitavara Chaudhary, for inviting me to this webinar, and also would like to thank other panelists for their, especially to Dr. Basu and Dr. Abhi Sarkar, for already making a lot of very pertinent points. Now, coming to the couple of issues that you have raised, especially on the macroeconomic implications, Now, let us assume that, as Dr. Basu already clearly mentioned, India was already in a slowdown phase even before the pandemic hit the country. Now, due to the pandemic as well as the lockdown that we already seen, the many indicators tell you that the Indian economy's growth would be substantially lower than what many of us are actually thinking. It went to an extent that RBI refused to forecast the GDP growth for the current financial year, which they generally do every 2 months. Now, we have also seen yesterday that we had some numbers coming for the IIP, that we have seen a substantially negative growth in the IIP numbers in the month of March, where the lockdown was very partial, and the CSO said, NSO said that they cannot predict, they cannot estimate the inflation numbers for the month of April. So, given this background, it's not a surprise to say that the GDP growth for the current financial year would be in a negative zone. So there are many indications that the GDP growth could be -2 or -3%. Even yesterday, IMF's chief economist tweeted that the outlooks appears to be deteriorating much faster than what IMF has projected 1 month back. So, given this kind of a context, very clearly, we are going to see a negative growth in the current financial year. And again, if you look at the inflation numbers, we should expect a rising inflation over a period of time. And now, so what needs to be done? I think that is the major question that many of us are actually asking right now. Yes, there was very clear unanimity in terms of providing fiscal support, whether it's a stimulus or whatever you may call it, fiscal support for various segments of the society, like the way Dr. Basu already clearly pointed out, for the poorer segments, MSMEs, some of the banking sector, NBFCs. So these are the places where we were expecting for a very substantial stimulus packages from the government of India. And again, as Professor Abhirup Sarkar pointed out, yesterday, the Prime Minister came out with a very huge stimulus package, 20 lakh crore, which comes close to 10% of GDP. And we have seen a lot of commentators commenting on that. This would be the biggest stimulus package anywhere in the world after United States as well as Japan. So while we are talking, the Finance Minister is making statements about what are the details of this fiscal stimulus measures. And we do see that there are indications that the substantial support would be provided to the MSME sectors in terms of the credit availability. Now, my own contention on this is that this 20 lakh crore actually includes the measures that RBI has already taken, or they're going to take in the couple of months. Now, I'm slightly surprised. Now, you do quantify the reduction in the repo rate as a stimulus and put a number like some lakh crore of support through reduction in the repo rate. And I think that's where the problem is. Now, we have already seen, the central banks across the world supporting, providing this kind of support for the ailing economies, but at the same time, they don't include as part of their estimation on the fiscal stimulus package. If you add this, for example, in 2008, I'm sure Mr. Mitra and Dr. Basu will know about it. Even that time, global financial crisis, RBI provided a much bigger substantial cut in the interest rate by 450 basis points. So the stimulus package around that time would be much more than what our textbooks right now say. So to that extent, I would argue that the stimulus package that the Prime Minister has declared, a large part of it is through the monetary policy. And there are estimates that say that nearly 8 lakh crore has already been provided through increasing liquidity as well as reduction in the repo rate and CRR rate. So now what left is something like 5% of GDP. And again, we need to keep in mind, because of expected negative growth in the current financial year, there would be a substantial reduction in the government revenues as well. Now, if that is the case, our own estimate says that at least for the central government, the reduction in the revenues because of the decline in the GDP growth should be close to 5 lakh crore for the central government, and for the state governments would be something like 2 lakh crore. So now if you add these two, something like 7 lakh crore reduction in the revenues that we should expect given the negative GDP growth. Now, this 12 lakh crore additional stimulus that the Prime Minister has promised, will that include that 7 lakh crore also? I think, in my view, yes, it should include, because you are not going to compromise on the expenditures that already been planned in the budget 2021. And we have already seen the government has actually increased the borrowing program for the current financial year, the first half of the financial year, from 7.8 lakh crore to 12 lakh crore. That means the additional 4.2 lakh crore largely to cover the decline in the revenues for the central government. So overall, I think my own calculation would say that the additional stimulus measures, expecting that there will be no further changes in the monetary policy, would be close to 3% of GDP. So in my view, that is a very substantial given the fiscal condition right now. Now, when it comes to its impact, as Professor Ajita Rai Chaudhary pointed out, its impact on the deficits, it will impact on the inflation, as well as its impact on the current account deficit. Now, if you want to consider all these things, certainly there would be some limits on the fiscal deficit. Now, even if you assume 3% additional fiscal deficit in the current year, our own calculation says that it would have a very, very huge impact on the inflation, because now, the first round impact, whenever there is going to be increase in the public expenditure, the first round impact would be more on the demand side, and the supply side would catch up with a lag. So we would see a substantial increase in the inflation in the first round. And at the same time, we also would see that there's going to be substantial increase in the current account deficit. Whether that is sustainable, I think that's a different story. But when we argue for fiscal stimulus, I think we need to be very clear what are those side effects on inflation as well as current account deficit. So with the 3%, in my view, I think we will be ending up with a slightly higher inflation, more than the threshold or the acceptable inflation. And at the same time, we'll also see a current account deficit going up more than slightly higher than the sustainable level of current account deficit. Here comes the legislation that Dr. Basu highlighted, a very sophisticated legislation of FRBM Act. So I think, although the fiscal stimulus is warranted right now, it's very important for this country to quickly come out with a package, come out with a strategy, an exit strategy from the fiscal stimulus, so that there would be some credibility on the public finances, and at the same time on the current account deficit as well as inflation. So I think already many places have highlighted the kind of FRBM roadmap that we are following is actually, although sophisticated, but it is a flawed FRBM roadmap. Now, this is very different from what was suggested in 2003. Now, since 2018, the kind of FRBM roadmap that we are following cannot be having expansionary impact on the growth. Rather, it will have a contractionary impact on the growth. So I think very quickly we need to revert back, and that will create some kind of credibility on the people who finance the fiscal deficit of the governments. I think on the multipliers, this is exactly the point is, now if you look at the FRBM Act, or if you look at the multipliers for various government capital expenditures, very clearly we know that the consumption expenditure multiplier is much, much lower than the capital expenditure. So I think we need to keep this in mind when we go for a stimulus package, where we try to, so the measures should be there to increase the capital expenditure. We already have a 5-year roadmap in terms of National Infrastructure Investment Plan, where we need to have something like 111 lakh crore investment into the infrastructure. So I think this may be an opportunity. As I said, this crisis should be taken as an opportunity to increase, public capital expenditure, even at the cost of exceeding on the fiscal deficit, because it will have a larger multiplier impact on future growth, and it will not have an inflationary impact. But if you increase the consumption expenditure as the way we are doing right now, I'm afraid that we might end up with a double-digit inflation, which might create a second round problems for us, as we have seen in 2009 and 2011. So we should not be doing a kind of a same mistake that we have done 10 years back. Now, as I say, some of the measures that have been already, the finance minister already made right now, it looks like we are actually putting entire pressure on the banking sector as well as RBI. I think that's not the way to go, because we know very well the banking sector already in a weak position. Now, by putting more pressure on public sector banks, I think we are going to weaken the overall financial sector, and which in turn will have negative impact on the financial access that Dr. Abhirup Sarkar pointed out. I think what is needed for us right now is we need to have measures to mobilize resources and channel towards productive purposes. And this is where we need to have strong public sector banks. We need to have more public sector banks, not less, the way we have right now. There's a whole argument right now is to downsize the public sector share. My view is that if at all you want to plan for this large investment that you're looking for in the infrastructure sector, I think we need more public sector banks, not less. So one last point here, for all these things, as Professor Ajita Raj Chaudhary raised, so who will finance this? Now, we are very clear that we don't want to depend on the foreign savings. Now, what is left is, it is the domestic savings and printing money. So you can only print as much, about 1.5% monetization of the deficit, but otherwise the rest of the stimulus needs to be financed by domestic savings. I think this is where my problem is. If you look at some of the measures we have been taking for the past couple of years or more than that, now most of the policies actually led to discouraging the savings. I think it's very important for all of us to believe and remember that Indian economy is more of savings-led growth. I think that's where Dr. Abhirup Sarkar's point, that impact of interest rates on investments is weak, but on the other hand, the impact of interest rates on savings is much, much higher. So there is a asymmetric impact of changes in interest rates on investments as well as savings. And in my view, I think we need to encourage savings if at all you want to finance the fiscal stimulus right now, and also for the medium-term infrastructure investments. So I think this is where we need to have more measures, whether the tax measures or the monetary policy measures, that would help revive the savings, which would actually help in reviving the investments, and then which will help actually revise the potential growth of the country. So I will stop here, and if there's any question, then I can get back.
I'm sorry, I just muted that.
Yes, sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Good presentation on, as we know, in the current account deficit, on the inflationary scenario, the savings rate discouraged past few years, real issue, how to finance this deficit, there are limits, important questions. So let's think about that. And now let me invite Mr. Debashish Mollik, the former DGM of Exim Bank. and also former MD and CEO of IDBI Mutual Fund. Well, again, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, but you just, if you can, touch upon this, that this global supply chain, this has come up in the discussion, including Prime Minister's speech yesterday. What do you think about that? What policies say the banking sector might play in this? Do you have, since you are a person who has dealt with the banking sector for such a long time? Another thing is the self-reliance. So do you think this, if all countries talk about self-reliance, are we moving back to a protectionist world? What's your take on that?
Thank you, Mr. Rajchaudhuri, Professor Rajchaudhuri, for inviting me in this webinar. It's really fortunate to have such eminent speakers as my co-speakers, and I'll surely one day boast of it. Thank you for that. Now, one more thing, just a matter of correction. I was the Deputy Managing Director of Exim Bank and not the Deputy General Manager. Anyway, that's just for records. That is not something to discuss with greatly. Now, coming to your point, actually, you have raised a very, very critical and important point. Now, in my opinion, though Professor Abhirup Sarkar touched this point, I think what this lockdown and what this COVID crisis happened was essentially a supply chain crisis. And I think the supply chain crisis is going to accentuate in the days to come. That is my feeling, primarily because what we did was we locked down every production. Whatever was inventory stock has been used. And today in Bombay also, I face shortage of small industrial products and commodities. It's not even simple consumables are not easily available as they used to be. Agricultural products and essential goods, there is no problem. But other things, even small things like washing machine, soap, detergent type of things are also not very readily available in the shelves in Bombay. Now, there was a supply crisis. There was a stoppage of production. Now, if you take it that a large amount of these production is directly or indirectly made by the MSME sector, that is, some of them directly market some product and some of them act as contractors or subcontractors to large firms. In that case, if the crisis continues and the MSME sector suffers, which could be primarily because I was recently reading some UK SINA report, which says that how long does it take an MSME to close down? So 45 days, you have something around 75% of the MSMEs closed down. Today in the newspapers, I find that some informal sector, there is a huge job loss and job unemployment. By MSME, we do not necessarily mean only registered MSMEs, we also mean informal sector MSMEs. So there would be a huge amount, there could be rather, a huge amount of disruption in the supply chain, which perhaps we have to factor in. And this factoring in will have to be done by way of easy liquidity and easy money. And in my opinion, and Professor Kaushik Basu is there, an eminent personality, I would feel that it's not an easy credit or credit guarantee which Government of India is speaking about, which can take care of this problem. We will perhaps look at something like an equity fund. If you are talking in terms of a startup fund always, and startup fund always, then we should now talk in terms of a re-startup fund so that these MSMEs and others can really start production and the supply chain gets restored. I think that is one particular point which I would like to highlight before I come to this. Now, obviously, the second point, and I will restrict myself only to the questions you have raised, the global value chain or the global supply chain. Now, that's a very, very important factor, and that is a very, very important thing which has happened. Now, if you really look at the emergence of the global value chain and the global supply chain, the emergence of the global value chain and global supply chain had a huge benefit in pulling out a large number of countries, especially the Asian tigers, as we call, and the East Asian countries, including the recent example of Vietnam or even Bangladesh, has been essentially a story of the global supply chain, where actually the global supply chain has enabled these countries to join the production scale of the global players And so it was something like they had produced in a particular country and sold to someone, and from their third country and all, and finally it went to the global stage. And what has happened is that this has helped them specialize in certain particular product. It has helped them increase their efficiency. It has helped them manufacture much larger quantities than they could ever have thought of. And earlier in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s, when we used to talk in terms of economic development as constraint of market size and all, now East Asian tigers had told us that there is no constraint on market size. And there was no constraint on market size because of export-led growth. And half of the export-led growth in their case, and especially as time progressed more and more with the emergence of China and all, you have a situation of more export growth primarily through supply to the global value chain. Now, the question I have is the global value chain on the way of disruption? If the global value chain continues, you have another Bangladesh as a possibility or another Vietnam as a possibility. If the global value chain actually is disrupted, and I find that there is quite a threat to the global value chain, not because of political design. Of course, there's a huge design of US-China trade war and all that, and that could be a very major thing because half of the global value chain has been able to function very efficiently, primarily because something which I call the Chinese pull. The Chinese have pulled so many production in so many small countries by aggregating the components and all, that could lead to a disruption if China is taken out of the trade. Of course, how much China can be taken out is a different issue, which I would like to discuss with you separately. But anyway, global value chain or global supply chain, whether it survives in the same way or not, I am really not very sure, because primarily the crisis was a crisis not only of demand, supply, and cash flow, but also a crisis of confidence. There has been a huge amount of confidence crisis, a huge amount of fear, which has come in the minds of the people. You do not know whether the world tomorrow will buy things from another country. You do not know whether the world tomorrow will actually go and do the business the same way they had been doing earlier. So I am not very sure of whether the global value chain will continue in this manner. What will happen if the global value chain does not continue is again a different issue. Now, India's place in the global value chain was there, but it was not as significant as the East Asian countries. But global value chain, except maybe automobile exports, and in auto components and automobile, India has been a leader. But otherwise, India has not been a very, very major player or major beneficiary. India is too large a country to just participate in global value chain. But what could be a threat is if the global value chain goes away, then a lot of components which India imports for assembling and exporting could also be affected by the global value chain not being there. That is one point which I would like to mention. The other important thing which you raised is that the question of self-reliance, which Honorable Prime Minister spoke to about last evening. Now, I really do not know what the self-reliant would actually finally import or what it would finally mean when it is actually rolled out. I hope it does not mean autarky. I hope it does not mean closed borders. I hope it means increasing efficiency, etc., etc. But the trouble is, if all countries start talking in terms of self-reliant, and this people could be logically talking primarily because of fear and crisis of confidence, in that case, one thing which could happen is that this self-reliant could automatically close access to a lot of markets for a lot of us. And that is where we could actually have a problem in pursuing our export strategy. So these are the two important points which I would like to mention, and I would conclude here and wait for anything further from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mullik. And important things, global value chain, you raise this fear, uncertainty in the mind of people in general. And that's where the action point is. That's how the countries must act together to bring that thing out of the danger zone. Well, let me come last but not least, Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya. I apologize for calling you Mr. Mukhopadhyay in the initial point. I don't know how Mr. Bhattacharya and Mr. Mukhopadhyay interchanged. But anyway, Mr. Bhattacharya,
The same four Brahman classes, sir. I mean, the confidence of
possibly it's in the same set. But anyway, you are also free 10 minutes if you can confine yourself. But nobody spoke about very clearly, this banking sector. If you have a lot of liquidity, two things are possible. In a scene of uncertainty, either the demand will not pick up, even if your real interest rate goes to close to negative, as we are watching it, we are finding it in all the Western nations, investment is not picking up, or the banks run into this problem of NPA and other things. And everybody is talking, so much is put into the bank now. What will happen to this banking sector? Are they strong enough? Is this the right approach the government is taking? If you can enlighten along other things on this issue, please. Mr. Bhattacharya.
So yes, I mean, thank you very much for this opportunity to Bengal Chambers and you, sir, for this opportunity. And delight as usual to listen to Dr. Basu, as all of us. As he said, he used to be my teacher at the Delhi School of Economics. So, I mean, all of us know that this crisis now is beginning to unfold as a very significant humanitarian crisis. But I'll confine myself to about 7 odd minutes to speak on some specific numbers. So the first point that we need to talk about is growth, because that's, I mean, what is the impact on growth? Because that will have an impact on credit and other issues coming in. So as Dr. Basu pointed out, we are entered this crisis into an already significantly weakened state. So it's not just the last couple of years. To my mind, I mean, this weakness started right from FY 14-15. All the balance sheet problems, etc., corporate balance sheet, banking balance sheet, then on to household balance sheets, etc. And unfortunately, right when we were just about, it looked as if we were beginning to improve in FY 19, the early part of FY 20. This COVID crisis started. Before that, the financial sector problems, the financial market volatility of NBFCs, others came to a head. But this is a very unusual confluence of 4 C's that I can see: credit, COVID, crude, and as Mr. Mullik pointed out, in the global scenario, definitely for India, confidence. So all 4 are acting together in various ways. I mean, and then there are multiple forces at work: demand and supply, the financial and real sector shocks, global and domestic shocks, etc. So there are multiple dimensions to this problem. It's not a very clear case, and that complicates the policy response. So even now, it's really difficult to predict the extent of growth slowdown. Much of it will depend on the immediate term, on the reopening sequence. But just plain algebra, that if we take now, it's beginning to look a little bit clear, more clear than what it used to be in the last 15 odd days. So with a lockdown, large lockdown till 17th of May, and then a 2-month recovery, it looks now as if growth, real GDP growth, is likely to be about minus 1.8%. So there are multiple ways, of course, that this forecast can go wrong. Just as a reference, our pre-COVID in February, our estimate of FY21 growth was about 5.2%. Instead of which, we are now at a real growth of minus 1.8%. Even more worrying than real growth, I think I have a little bit of a disagreement with Professor Bhanumurthy here, which we'll discuss separately. I think inflation, the GDP deflators that we are talking about, definitely the WPI inflation, which is a larger part of the GDP deflator basket than the CPI. The nominal growth that we are seeing now probably is likely to be close to about 0 to 1%. So that is to say, GDP deflator of 2.5%. So that's a worrying part. Last year, nominal growth would have been about 7.5%. The implication of this is that we are staring at an income loss, a GDP nominal income loss of anywhere between 8 to 12 lakh crores relative to the pre-COVID numbers in FY21. So that's a significant amount, and that will shape the policy response going forward. The second part is recovery. As Dr. Basu also pointed out, a lot will depend on the reopening, the phasing of the reopening. But even more significantly now, once the situation reopens, depends on the interplay between all the inventories that have been built up in multiple sectors. The automobile sector is a clear example. FMCG, consumer durables, and a whole bunch of other segments, inventories versus consumer demand. I mean, consumer demand, that's last C that we talked about, confidence. Remember, I think is a very, very unknown quantity at this point in time. There are multiple behavioral stimuli that will shape consumer behavior, and that relative to the levels of inventory and output production increases. We were having a fascinating conversation with a large steel manufacturer right before we joined in. So that they are starting their production quickly now. But I mean, there's a huge loss that they had in March. April began to become a little better, etc. So that becomes a problem. So in the near term, that sequencing the reopening is very, very important. Unfortunately, in the global the way that economic activity is concentrated, the red zones and particularly the hotspots in the red zones, those account for a very large segment. I mean, if you look at credit, for which we have more current information as of September of last year, the credit accounts credit in these red zones was about 72 to 74% of the total credit in the country. I mean, there are multiple ways of looking at this, just to keep that in mind. Secondly, there are two input markets that will be very, very important going forward. One, of course, which is what I'm going to talk about, credit markets. The second is labor market. Labor is the last part of the 4 C's. Together with the 4 C's, the last bit, which is the labor dislocation that we are seeing, which is a large segment of the humanitarian crisis that we were talking about. That large labor has become a very, very important component, and particularly we do not have enough understanding of internal migration, etc. So keep that as it may. So I'll focus on credit. So the third part is the credit part. So bank credit in the growth in FY20 was about 6%. Apart from the post-demonetization period, which was a different dynamics altogether, that 6% is one of the lowest in the last 10 years or so. Even during after the global financial crisis, it was not this low. So I mean, it's significantly low disbursement of credit. Multiple reasons. One part, of course, is the risk aversion that we talked about in the banking sector. Credit has picked up in April to 6.7%, the last number that I saw, but for 2 reasons. One is this is a diversion of a flow of funds, diversion of funding from other non-bank entities, NBFCs, mutual funds, other entities in the system, some ECBs, external commercial borrowings itself, into banks. So, I mean, the others do not have the capacity to lend and are not lending. So banks are the lenders of, semi-last resort in this environment. And the second is that all lines of credit, whatever lines of credit, Mr. Mullik would know about this, all lines of credit that has been sanctioned are now being drawn down. Companies now want to create liquidity buffers. And very, very unfortunately, what has happened is that in the flow, in the supply chain, the vendor supply chain, large companies are also, because of their own credit cash flow problems, etc., they have also stopped paying MSMEs to a very large significant extent, and MSMEs have to draw up lines of credit on working capital, etc. So the response of the Reserve Bank of India, they have acted very, very proactively in this environment. My own sense is, given the different natures of the underlying shocks in the global financial crisis and the current problems, I think the Reserve Bank has probably acted more aggressively now than it had acted in the global financial crisis environment. But the problem is, the amount of liquidity that they have pushed out into the system, initially through the liquidity adjustment facility, the LAF, then the LTROs, then the TLTROs, the targeted LTROs, and the TLTRO 2.0, and etc. Have all this money, most of this money that they have pushed out has gone right back to the Reserve Bank as excess reserves, and banks are still, even till yesterday, banks are still keeping about 6.5 lakh crores of the total amount of money that they have got back with the central bank, even though the reverse repo rate has been taken down to about 3.75%. So this risk aversion is a problem. You probably have seen some of the measures that have come out today with the Ministry of Finance. So a large part of it is targeted towards lending more towards MSMEs. I mean, I'm not very sure. I mean, going forward, how much fresh credit will come in. But beyond any smidgen of doubt, and as has happened with most countries in the world, not just central banks, the amount of backstops through credit guarantees, other measures, off-balance sheet funding, etc., that would need from the central bank and from the fisc, from the balance sheet of the government, will need to increase significantly for banks to come in. Because, I mean, remember, it's not just a matter of liquidity. I think the biggest constraint on banks, other than the risk aversion, given the fact that there are already concerns about increasing NPAs in the system, the amount of capital that banks will have access to, particularly public sector banks, which is where the capital is sorely needed at this point in time. There has to be a means of recapitalizing the public sector banks. And together with this, I think I'm increasingly, I used to be very, very, very reluctant to even say the word that a bad bank, given all the issues of moral hazard, etc., the asymmetric selection problems, etc., that will come in. But I think as of this point in time, in order to get credit growth moving, which is very, very critical. I mean, you will not go anywhere without credit moving back into the system. The ability of the fisc is so much limited. So I think a large part of the fisc, which remains after all the human-related subventions, the income loss related subventions, I think will need to be focused on pushing credit into the system. And that's where, I mean, so I'll leave it at that, and then anything else that needs to be discussed. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. It's you know, your this idea, I mean, this concept of whether there are moral hazards or asymmetric information doesn't matter. We have to push in credit right now. That's the most important issue. Well, we have, you know, whatever time was allotted, we are 4 minutes past that. So organizers, how much time can we now have? 10 minutes more, or if you can let me know. There are a number of questions. And so 10 minutes.
We can have 15 minutes for Q&A.
If the you know, our panel and guest speaker agree, well, if they are.
I would have to leave in 10 minutes, but 15 minutes if we can stay with, that's fine. I will manage that.
Well, you know, any of you can react to some of these things which have been discussed, but there are some issues which have come up. And most of them are to, you know, it's understandable to Professor Kaushik Basu. One question says that, by the you said that whatever financial aid they are talking about, MSME, but there is apparently there should not be a big distinction between MSME and large because they are interdependent. So where the credit goes, does it matter really that much? That's one of the questions. And let me put the questions. Some other question says that, you know, India trying to attract investment now, diverting from China maybe. Is it a wise move that we are trying to get things from, you know, diverted from whatever was there, maybe China was producing, and we are trying to get into this assembling business? Is that fair enough? Is that a good move? Then there are issues which have been raised. Unemployment, a big question. I don't think you have answered right now. Given the situation right now, the unemployment situation which has emerged from different statistics which you have seen, shot up to the CMI saying it's shot up from something like 8% to 27% or so. What's your suggestions that how can be a sustainable policy be there so that the unemployment problem can be tackled? You know, Professor Basu, if you can reply to this first, I mean, then I can go to.
Okay, I could reply to these and also touch one or two things.
Yes, sure.
The others said, and then I'll leave it. Others may have things to say.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the credit has to be directed to MSMEs. So the question of whether there are complementarities, but I feel that the credit support has to be primarily directed to MSMEs. Also because they will literally, as the numbers were just now provided, that within a couple of weeks, they're going to crash and just vanish from the surface. So there's the urgent need. The point I was making there is that if you make room for the economy to function, then the big ones will very quickly get back. So if you don't keep it so controlled, which also touches a little bit on what Obirup said earlier, transportation and movement, we don't think of that. Very often people were, when they are looking at lockdowns in different countries, they were assuming every country had stopped transportation altogether. That was indeed not the case. So transportation is important because barring a small segment of workers who can sit and work by Zoom, our workers need to move. And with that, there are risks that has to be managed, is what I was stressing on. The diversion from China, I don't fully follow. The main thing is not diversion from China. China, as it becomes better off, China's per capita income is about 4 times ours now. It is vacating space. And that space where cheaper labor can get in, what we have seen over the last couple of years, Vietnam has gotten in a big way, Bangladesh has gotten in a big way. And I feel we all still have a lot of very cheap labor, and that ties up with the question of unemployment. We have to pay attention to that. The unemployment figure, I'm glad you brought this in, is the 27% CMIE. That's the best actually data now we are getting on unemployment is the CMIE data. The long run unemployment problem is very different from this. I mean, 27% is a crazy level. In the United States, there are now predictions saying that it's going to cross 30%. It's going to go up. So those are where you have to just provide immediate support. These are, in India, these are very, very poor people. And of the Prime Minister's package, these are all fresh estimates coming out. Of the 20 lakh crores, there are now estimates that 4.2 lakh crores will be direct cash handouts. So those will have to be directed largely to the poor and to the people who are currently unemployed. And the long run unemployment is a different challenge. I just want to touch on 2 things related to actually what all the speakers were saying just now. Very, very lovely comments, I have to say. I've picked up lots of ideas. 2 points of warning. One which came up in several of these comments. Inflation, right now we can't worry much about that. But we have to remember what happened in 2008-9, when all countries in the world were expanding their fiscal deficit, injecting liquidity. The central banks came in injecting liquidity. And from 2009 to 2012, it was a global inflation problem. And we could get into that. So we have to keep that in mind. I was actually happy to hear whose calculation was this, that the deficit is the expenditure package in terms of net additional money could be something like 3%. Yes. My own calculation, Manu's estimate, my view was, we do want to have the expenditure much more than what India was doing in the beginning, but 3 to 4% is the right amount. And if that is being targeted, then that's broadly the right amount that is being targeted here. And one more thing, which is the credit that Shogoto talked about. You know, these are the sort of long run problems which will come up. India's growth slowdown has one very deep factor which does not receive much attention. Our savings rate and investment rate. When India had risen to East Asian levels, I mean, we were saving and investing roughly 38% of our GDP. That has been declining steadily over the last couple of years, and it's down to somewhere 30%. Related to credit growth, related to a variety of factors. And if we want to expand our infrastructure, unless we can get our savings rate up and investment rate up, which has gone down, we will never manage those targets. And these will do a lot of long run damage even after this pandemic is done. Let me stop with that because we don't have too much time.
Well, a question to Obiru. It says that we need labor intensive industries to pick up at this moment. And what can be done really specific? Do you have any suggestions so that these things can be given us somewhat a biased policy incentive in some sense or not? How can that be done?
I think it can be done. MSME is a good idea. It's a sector that we should focus on. China has, most of its exports were produced in the MSME sector, but with a very important caveat. That is, the MSMEs that we need to focus on need to be efficient. Its smallness can be very advantageous. It could be very flexible, provided it's using the state-of-the-art techniques. it's managing labor properly, and so on. We do not want MSMEs that are merely surviving. Unfortunately, in our country, a large part of the MSMEs are just there for survival. It's an indication that we are poor. We should not focus on that kind of MSMEs. If we could build up with all these packages, or even without them, if we could build up MSME sector which can compete in the world market, only then we can think of Make in India, and only then we can talk about this Atmanirbharata or self-reliance in a meaningful way.
Can I intervene, Ovirup? So do you say that some of this MSME should have a natural death because they are inefficient?
That's a very...
I don't know. I mean, it's very provocative, which I'm saying.
See, the point is that in our country, because there is a lack of opportunities, people have to find a way to survive, right?
Yeah.
And many MSMEs are providing them a sort of means to survive, right? But you cannot build up your long-term economic policy, stance on those MSMEs. MSMEs are labor intensive. Yes, they are very flexible. These are the advantages, but they have to be efficient. I'm just underscoring the word efficiency. That is very important.
Okay, one question I go to now, Bhanu. You talked about infrastructure and capital investment in capital sector. Capital investment has a larger multiplier. How do you think that the infrastructure investment can pick up? What will be the basic strategy at the moment? One can wish, but it may not be successful.
Yeah, so thank you. Unfortunately, even this number was not available for this country until recently. Now we do have some numbers. I hope Dr. Basu remembers. We were making a presentation to him when he was in the Ministry of Finance. For the first time, we did estimate the multipliers for various expenditures. Now, for the infrastructure, we did find the capital expenditure, for that matter. The multiplier size was 2.45, whereas for the consumption expenditure is less than 1. So I think this is the whole crux of the FRBM, where we actually do the expenditure switching from consumption to capital, and that actually leads to higher GDP growth, and it brings down the public debt to GDP ratio over a period of time. And that's the whole macro framework that we have for the FRBM. Now coming to this infrastructure investment, well, as many people argued, I think it is not just the finances, and I think what is more important is the overall ease of doing business. Again, Dr. Basu highlighted that India actually did very well in terms of improving its ranking in the doing business thing. And there are two more constraints that we had in the overall doing business or attracting more investments. I think that part was not discussed today, is about the land and labor markets. So I think now we already seen that some of the states have actually gone in terms of labor market reforms. And I certainly feel that they did benefit, like for example, Rajasthan and Gujarat. But I'm not commenting on the recent reforms that the states like UP or Madhya Pradesh brought in. But there are some reforms that happened on the factor markets. So by doing this, like land, labor, as well as the liquidity, like the Prime Minister highlighted yesterday, now and the legal system, I'm sure we would be able to attract more investment in this country. So there are many success stories. I think, again, I know Dr. Basu repeated many times about Vietnam. So how Vietnam is attracting more investments. So I think there are many lessons everywhere. And I'm sure some of the states already started, following that kind of path. My guess is that if we follow in the same path, I think we would be able to achieve whatever the target that National Infrastructure Mission has projected for the next 5 years.
Thank you. I don't think there is any specific question which is there, which I can ask. I am provided with the short filtered out questions which are there. and more or less I have mixed them up and asked the question. Bhanu, do you have any idea what FM said today? Any great things which in one word you can say? I mean, if there's something which has been said. I got a message here that no mention is there about direct benefit to the poor.
Sorry, I am deprived of this whole press brief. So maybe once I go back, we can check it.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. If there is no mention that anything is given direct transfer to poor in this package, I don't know, because we haven't heard about it.
No, but I have heard this is only one of the interviews, many interviews that are going to follow.
That's
so
right.
We'll see for tomorrow. Tomorrow, I think your concern may be addressed, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I was just a comment. It just came through it. Yeah. I think we should have to wrap up now. It's a wonderful thing. We got, all dimensions are discussed, and we have to have a take from this, jot it down, and put it in some form. And if we can get a transcript or something of that sort, all of us, that will be really good, because we can then think about it. And especially Professor Basu's lecture is all encompassing, touching upon so many things, and each one of them can be subject of a long discussion and seminar. As usual, I always find that whatever he says in one point maybe, but that you have to think, social media and what he says, salience. It's a huge thing now. So much is moving around in social media, confusing people, directing them to wrong ideas. And Professor Basu, in some point, let's have a discussion on this psychology, the social media. It's a very, important thing nowadays. How we are moving to the digital India, that's our goal. But this thing will come in, and that may play a very important role. Well, I think there will be a vote of thanks or something from Sumbit, from somewhere, from your side, or if you can, then
yes,
we can just wrap up.
Would request our chairperson, Mr. Sunil Mitra, to provide a formal vote of thanks to all the speakers.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
All right. We kind of overshot a little bit on time. I had actually expected worse, but it's been rather interesting and fairly widely. We have been able to encompass a large number of topics, a large number of issues that we will try and filter through and take away and prepare together a set of recommendations that we can take up at different levels in the governments. So I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank Professor Basu, firstly, for having given us this time and been with us. This does not mean, of course, Professor Basu, that the Bengal Chamber is not going to want you physically to come and address its members. We will still hope that will happen sooner rather than later, once things resume and become normal. I hope that happens someday, sooner again rather than later. And I would like to thank each of the other panelists. I would like to thank my colleague and my Economic Affairs Committee, Professor Raichaudhuri, for having painstakingly, taken us and guided us through this rather difficult and area, and with so many experts, he has negotiated this extremely well. Thank you very much, all of you, and I would like to lastly thank my colleagues on the Chamber Secretariat, who I am sure have been very attentively following all of these proceedings, and will, as always, turn out a brilliant transcript of all that. I would like to thank everyone, and once again, and thank you for being with us. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.